All right, so I really like making chairs, but I often find that my ability to come up with an idea far outweighs my ability to do a good sketch or 3D model of it. So recently when I had an idea for a chair, I decided to skip the sketch phase and jump straight into making a miniature. So it's really rough, it's just some 9mm MDF hot glued together, but it essentially functions as a 3D model and gives me plenty of information and dimensions to work off to dive straight into a full scale build. So in this video, I'm going to turn this baby chair into a fully grown chair. So when I made the miniature, I took some measurements from another chair I'd made just to get the general height and width right, and ended up making it at a 1/3 scale, which meant that I could take any measurements that I liked from that small scale version and just make them 2/3 bigger for this template. There's never anything overly complicated about making these templates. Once I've got the measurements right for where the joinery is going to be happening, the rest of it's sort of just cobbling it together with essentially whatever looks right. So one of the reasons I wanted to make this chair, beyond essentially having an idea and wanting to make the idea, is that I've got a few table commissions coming up, and eventually down the track I'd love to have, I guess, a collection of chair designs, and I could say, hey look, would you like a set of chairs with your table? I'll delve into this a little bit more throughout this video, but I'll sort of discuss why that's not super business savvy. But I guess the long story short of it is that chairs are pretty hard to make and they take a while, and I don't think people are willing to spend all that much money on chairs. Well, at least in comparison to, say, a table. So as much as I'm making this chair because I love making chairs, I also sort of looked at this project through the lens of making it as a commission and seeing how much wood I used and how long it takes and whether it would even be viable to make given the tooling that I've got available to me. Anyway, back to the build. So far all I've been doing is essentially cutting out the templates, and here I'm just refining the shape at the spindle sander. I'm going to be making these chairs out of Victorian ash. I picked up a whole bunch of this wood off a local furniture maker who was selling them quite cheaply. They make giant tables, and I guess this length isn't all that useful, but it's perfect for making chairs. As these chunks are quite large and quite rough, I find it easier just to break everything down at the bandsaw as opposed to potentially having issues with the blade squeezing at the table saw. Then I can flatten two faces at the jointer and then finish off the final sizing at the table saw. When I was cutting out the templates, I cut small sections off the top before cutting it to the final length, which means I've got little setup guides for cutting the final pieces to width. And instead of mucking around at the bandsaw, I find it's easy enough to just cut the final width at the table saw. And I do this in a couple of passes just so that my saw doesn't bog down too much. I think the reason why I find chairs so alluring or exciting to make is there's sort of like an element of unknowability about them. And what I mean by that is if you've made a table or a chest of drawers or a bedside table or something, you learn a bunch of lessons from making that first one, and they're often quite applicable to the next ones you end up making. And obviously there's complications and things to figure out with every project. But there's something about chairs where every single one is quite different. And I guess if you've made hundreds of chairs, you'll start to learn the sort of intricacies of them. But I find that every single one I make is so different that it's just a complete learning experience every single time. And generally for each chair design, I'm making 2 or 3 chairs before I've got one that I'm happy with. Anyway, whilst I've been waffling, I made a simple sled to help me cut the outside angle on the front leg. And then I'm just cutting the inside angle on the bandsaw. After carefully sticking these templates back onto the blanks, I take it off to the router table and just template route these parts out. I can use these offcuts here to create the rails that will connect the front legs to the back legs. I'm going to be using two 8mm dominoes for these legs. I'd ideally be using 10mm dominoes, but the legs weren't quite thick enough. And this slightly foreshadows a problem I have a bit further down the track. To connect everything together, I'm going to make a central hub which the legs will radiate out from. And here I'm finding the center points on each side so I can put some dominoes in them. I initially thought about making a template for this part, but I figured it would probably just be easier and quicker just to do it straight onto the workpiece. After cutting these corners off at the bandsaw, I just finished it off at the spindle sander. After the legs have finished drying, I'm giving them a 15mm radius round over at the router table. The total leg thickness is 30mm, so this will make it seem like the legs are perfectly round. And I do this in multiple passes, just increasing the height of the bit each time, which just helps avoid any tear out and stops the router from having to work too hard. So what I'm doing here is the first of many, learning experiences on this chair, and that's routing a round over on the top of the legs, which is actually completely unnecessary because that's where the seat top will be sitting. And having it rounded over there actually sort of ends up making it difficult for a few different processes down the track. Making the miniature version of this chair was definitely very helpful to get an idea of what this chair would look like in real life, but it obviously doesn't help in any way when it comes to the construction, and that's generally where I make most of my mistakes. I mean, oftentimes there's something when I've finished a design where I go, oh, I wish I changed that, but mostly I get to a certain point of a build and I go, oh, okay, well, I don't know how I'm going to do that. I've made a mistake here. Next time round, I know what to do differently. And I thought that central hub was a good idea initially, but the more I went through this build, the more I thought that that probably wasn't the best idea. Moving on to the seat top itself, I had a couple of panels that I'd glued up for a previous project that I didn't end up actually using, so that was perfect for this project. This is obviously way bigger than it needs to be for a single seat top, but there were a few cracks running through it that I knew I'd have to trim off. Whilst that dried up, I cut out a piece of cardboard to create a rough outline of the seat. Once I was happy with the general shape, I could get on with cutting out a template from some MDF. I'm using this thinner piece of MDF to make a really rudimentary circle cutting jig. This line down the middle is to line up the pivot point with the router, and you'll see what I mean in a second. After cutting a hole in the middle of my seat blank, I can cut a couple of holes in this piece of MDF, and this essentially acts as my big compass. And I'm using a small piece of 6mm dowel as the pivot. And next I can measure the distance, which will be the radius of my cut, and I can drill a hole for the router bit to go through. It's just a guide. And I'm just double-sided taping my router to this jig. It's pretty strong tape, so I'm confident that it's not going to move around on me. I was initially cutting this full depth, but then I realized it'd probably be easier just to cut a small groove, which I can finish off at the bandsaw and then just flush trim at the router table. I measured the distance between the two front legs and marked out where the center points of each leg are. I then drilled out 2 holes with a 35mm Forstner bit. Because the legs are 30mm rounds, this will leave about a 2.5mm reveal around the top of the leg, which I think will be a nice little touch. At this point, the panel that I glued up for the seat base had dried up, so I could get on with cutting this to the final size. And then it's just a matter of tracing the template onto that piece of wood, and I can take it across to the bandsaw, roughly cut out the shape, and once I've done this, I can take it across to the router table and finish it off. It's a pretty good idea to have your grain direction figured out in a situation like this. If you're cutting against the grain, it can really easily lead to a catch, which is really unpleasant if you've ever had that happen. And I put a round over on the underside of the seat, which is the same radius as what the legs got. So this next process was actually a huge waste of time. I've got a seat back mold from another chair that I make, and I thought I could use that, but in the back of my mind I knew that it wasn't quite right. So I'm obviously racing through this whole process, but essentially I steam bent and did a glue lamination for this seat back, and then didn't end up using it. Alright, I sort of suspected this might be the case while I was making it, but this seat back is just not quite right. I think the radius just needs to be a bit bigger or smaller, or just whatever, similar to the seat base. It's a bit of a silly mistake, but that's alright, I'll just make another one. So I've mocked this up with a piece of scrap wood, and I quite like the tighter radius of this. And I'm going to use my circle cutting jig that I made earlier, which I've stuck to the workbench, to try and transfer that radius onto this piece of MDF. This took a little bit of fiddling, but eventually just moving that sheet closer to the pivot point, I reached the point at which I found the radius that I was after. And it didn't have to be super precise, just close. Then I double-sided taped the MDF to the workbench so I could cut the inside and the outside of the arc. Again, I'm drilling out this hole just as a guide for where the router bit will need to go. And then this is more or less the same process as cutting the seat base out, where I cut a groove and then finished it off at the bandsaw and the router table. After cutting the inside radius, I drilled another hole about 2 centimeters further from the first hole, which allowed me to route the groove for the outside radius. And because it was taped to the table the whole time, it came out perfectly offset from the inside radius. And I didn't bother filming flushing this up, as I showed that earlier. This next process was a bit of an experiment. I really didn't want to make another steam bending mold, as it takes quite a while and I wasn't super confident that I would like this seat back. So I decided to laminate a few chunks up that are thick enough to take the whole seat back. And this ended up working pretty well. At this point I was reasonably resigned to the fact that this chair was probably going to be a prototype for a few reasons, so I wasn't overly precious about the wood I was using here. There's a few cracks which I suspected I might have to do some repairs on, but for the purposes of a learning experience, that's a price I was more than happy to pay. And I didn't end up actually filming this process, but I ended up just taking this to the spindle sander and refining that shape. After cutting this seat back to length, I thought that the square edges looked a little bit bland, so I decided to add a little bit of a shape to the underside, and I think it ended up looking quite nice. And here I'm giving it that 15mm radius that most of the other parts have already got. Up until this point, I wasn't super sure about how I would attach this seat back to the legs. In the back of my head, I'd sort of imagined some sort of dowel thing or like a brass rod or something. But I realised at this point that the only thing that would really look right is if this seat back was sunk into a recess cut into the legs. And as I knew this was going to be a prototype, I was happy just to cut this by hand and think about how to do this properly on the next version. And for this version, I just decided to use screws to attach it. Here I'm carefully positioning the seat top where I get an even reveal around the top of those front legs. And again, I'm just attaching this with screws. I'll eventually use threaded inserts and bolts that go through oversized holes, but for the time being this will be fine. After I gave it a coat of oil and just looked at it for ages, I still thought it needed a little bit of extra shape and decided that I'd carve a bit of a profile on the top. I'm drilling some guide holes to help me as I carve, and these will just let me know when I've reached the right depth. Then I took everything to the driveway and probably drove my neighbours absolutely mad with this noise. This was actually the first time I've used one of these cut-saw dishes, and it was actually pretty easy to get the hang of and pretty enjoyable aside from all of the dust and the noise it made. I've got the extreme cut-saw dish, which leaves a fairly rough surface, so that takes a bit of sanding to get it all nice and smooth. Then the final step was to just give it a very small round over on the back just to soften it up a little bit. Alright, so version 1 of this chair is now done and I'm pretty happy with it. I really like the way it looks, but there's just a few problems with it design-wise that I'm just going to have to fix up. Firstly, this back rail, the way it attaches to the legs, I'm thinking I'm going to have to figure out a way of cutting these notches before the legs have been rounded. I just can't really think of a way of making this once the legs have been rounded. Problem number 2 was I somehow mucked up the template and cut the back legs too short, so these legs have got a little block glued onto the bottom, which is fine, but I'd like to fix that up. But the biggest problem, and this is more of a structural issue and it's a pretty big problem, is just how much flex this has got. So normally with a chair you've got a rail or a stretcher or whatever you want to call it coming off one way, and then you've got another rail coming off this way, which stops the chair from rocking around. Whereas this one's only got rails coming off in one direction, and that's obviously not creating enough stiffness. I've added a few little brackets underneath to try and sort of stiffen everything up, but that hasn't really worked. So I think the only solution here is just to thicken these parts up. I'm going to use some epoxy, which will hopefully stiffen everything up a bit. And I'm going to put more dominoes essentially in there just to sort of try and stiffen everything up. And I've got no idea whether that'll work, but I've got to give it a crack, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. So I'm going to remake these templates and get on with a second version of this chair. So I've made these new templates, and you can see here this line where the original templates went. So I've added maybe 12 or 15 mil of extra thickness. Which isn't massive, but I'm hoping that'll be enough to just sort of give it a bit of extra stiffness. So I'm not going to go through the whole build again, I'll just sort of cover the things that I'm changing for this next iteration. So firstly, I've cut those dominoes on the wider setting, and I'm making my own dominoes here. So essentially I'm getting about twice the width of a regular domino, which will hopefully give me some extra strength. And I thought I may as well make a whole bunch while I'm at it. The next step was figuring out a way of cutting the backrest notches whilst everything's still square, so after a dry fit I can figure out what angle the back intersects the legs at. And this ended up being about 10 degrees, I think. So my plan was to make an angled sled that I can clamp to the legs and then route the notches out. So the first step was to cut a couple of blocks of wood to that 10 degrees. So I'm just making a little sled here to help me do that. These two blocks are separated by a piece that's the width of the seat back, and this initial piece of MDF I'm attaching to the top is just to temporarily hold everything together. This next piece is the fence, which will be used to butt up against the leg and hold the sled in the right spot. And this final piece of MDF I'm attaching here is just to hold everything in place when I remove this top piece. I realised that the seat back doesn't actually intersect with the legs at right angles, so I have to add a slight splay to this sled so that it will cut the notch at a slight angle. I left a bit of extra length at the top of the legs for this particular purpose, and this just helps me hold the sled to the leg nice and tightly whilst I'm routing it. I added a little bit of painter's tape to the back of this so I didn't get any blowouts, and I did this in a couple of passes just to be on the safe side. And I nicked the seat back from chair number 1 just to see if this is all looking right, and surprisingly that worked pretty well. Now that I've got those notches cut and everything's looking fine, I'm going to use some 2-part epoxy to glue these legs together. And this stuff dries super hard, so I'm pretty confident this is going to add some extra stiffness in comparison with regular wood glue. The next hurdle to jump is the middle hub, and I thought that gluing in a domino horizontally and vertically would help to stop it twisting. So I'm building this little platform which will hold the domino at a specific height, which will help me cut a domino perfectly in the middle. And that's a little bit hard to explain what I mean by that, but you'll see in a second what it does. Part of the beauty of the domino is that there's a bit of wiggle room left and right in the mortise. But cutting these mortises at right angles from each other means that I have to be super accurate and there's no longer any wiggle room. And if any of these 8 mortises are even slightly off, it just throws everything off. And ultimately the design of this hub is actually just a bit of a bottleneck, and I think in the future I might just replace this with a simple half lap, which I think will do the same thing. And again, I had to make 2 of these chairs to come to that conclusion. Circling back to the start of the video where I was being maybe a bit dramatic saying that making chairs is bad business, I think the fact is that chairs are just really complicated and they take a long time, and the profit margin just isn't there compared with other furniture, in my opinion. I think if I was in a real flow state and I was batching a bunch of these out, I could maybe do a chair in a day to a day and a half, which means that pure cost of materials plus my labour might end up being about, $600 to $800 per chair, before any profit margins, which could mean that a single chair is maybe $1,200. And that's a lot for someone to spend on a single chair, let alone a set. And comparing that with a table, which could easily sell for several grand. And I know they use more wood, but they take a lot less effort and just aren't as hard to build. And I think the general population are just more likely to spend good money on a table compared with chairs. Now, I know this thinking is purely for someone trying to make money off woodworking, and obviously doesn't apply to a hobbyist. But as someone trying to take a hobby and turn it into a jobby and then lean more towards the job side than the hob side, it's an interesting experiment. In saying that though, I'm not going to stop building things that I enjoy just because they might not be profitable, but it is an interesting thought to have every now and again when making things. Anyway, enough about that. What you've been watching me do whilst I've been waffling away is using little dowels to attach the seat back to the chair. And that more or less completes the making of this second iteration. And I decided to experiment with the finish for this one, and I'm using a Sam Maloof style finish, which is a 3-part mix of tung oil, oil-based polyurethane, and a thinner, which in this case is terps. And it takes about 3 coats, but I really like the finish of it. It adds a little bit more protection than a hard wax oil does. It's obviously a little bit more effort, but I think it's worth it in the end. Alright, so version 2 of this chair is now done. I'm really happy with it. I think the only thing that I would change is the hub that's on the underside. The reason I designed it like that was just so the roundover can transition nice and smoothly, but it's on the underside, you can't really see it, and it's just a real bottleneck to make that part and make it accurately. So I think just a basic half flap would be absolutely fine. All the changes that I made to help stiffen it up have really worked. So now it's perfectly strong. I've got no concerns about that. If I was being a tiny little bit nitpicky, I'd make an adjustment to this jig. There's a little bit of a gap down the bottom here, which just means that the splay isn't quite right, but it's pretty minor, so I'm just letting it fly for this one. So I reckon there's probably one more iteration of this chair down the track for me, but for now, I'm gonna call it quits. So thanks for watching. It's absolutely stinking hot in my shed right now, so I'm gonna leave it there, but here are some beauty shots.